Welcome to the Missing Dots podcast. In today's special episode, we are doing something important. We are looking at Yazid ibn Muawiya with fresh eyes, away from loud emotions and old fights. We will check real historical writings, understand the chain of events at Karbala, and see why some stories became so big while others stayed quiet. This is not about praising or blaming anyone blindly. It is about finding truth through facts so our hearts and minds can find peace. Let us begin this journey together.
Yeah, it really is a heavy history to look at. And when you sit here with these early historical texts, the chronicles and legal rulings, the first thing you actually notice is just how distorted the picture of Yazid's reign has become.
Right, because you basically grow up hearing one extreme or the other, depending on where you are.
Exactly. It's a 3.5-year reign from the year 60 to 64 AH, and it's totally overshadowed. On one side, you've got this folkloric image of him as this cartoonish, almost supernatural monster. And then on the flip side, you find some of these modern revisionist efforts trying to present him as like a perfectly innocent, pious victim of circumstance.
Like he had absolutely no idea what his governors were up to.
Right, which is just not historically accurate.
Yeah.
So if we want to find any actual peace of mind here, we have to kind of push both of those extremes off the table.
We need like a cold audit of the facts.
Exactly. A forensic, legal, and historical audit of his actual rule.
And I guess to do that fairly, we should probably start by figuring out exactly where he fits into the timeline, right? Because his generation changes the rules of how early scholars were even allowed to judge him.
It changes everything, honestly. It dictates how he's evaluated in classical Islamic jurisprudence. So Yazid was born around the year 26 AH, which is roughly 646 CE.
So that's during the Caliphate of Uthman.
Exactly. And that timeline is vital because it means Yazid never met the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He belongs strictly to the generation called the Tabi'i, the successors.
So he is not a Sahabi, not a companion.
No, not at all.
For someone listening who, might not be steeped in the legal side of this history, why does that label matter so much? Like companion versus successor?
Well, it matters because the companions hold a very specific protected theological status. There's this concept in the Islamic tradition known as adala.
Which means?
It basically refers to collective probity, the inherent righteousness and trustworthiness of the companions. Because they were direct witnesses to the revelation, classical scholars operate on the principle that you just don't impugn their foundational character.
Okay. So you might disagree with their political choices, but their spiritual integrity is, shielded.
Precisely.
Okay, I'm trying to think of how this works in other structures. It's almost like a form of constitutional immunity for the founding fathers of a nation.
That is a really great way to put it, yeah.
Like, as long as you're part of that original founding group, history treats your underlying motives with absolute reverence. But the second the next generation steps into power,
the immunity vanishes.
Right, they're just regular citizens subject to the normal penal code.
That is exactly how it works. Yazid was second generation. He did not inherit that theological shield. So his actions, his commands, his personal behavior, they were all evaluated purely under standard political and criminal law.
Which is why the classical scholars could be so hard on him.
Exactly. That's why intellectual giants like Ibn Taymiyyah or al-Dahabi felt entirely free to severely criticize him. They didn't have to worry about insulting a companion because he wasn't one. He was a political ruler, subject to the law.
Which brings us to the tragedy that basically defines his legacy, right? Karbala. Yeah. If he is being judged under standard criminal law, how do these early scholars evaluate his responsibility for the massacre? We are talking about the Prophet's grandson, Imam Hussain, his family, deprived of water in the desert and brutally killed.
It's horrifying.
It is. So how do the jurists legally connect that battlefield to the man sitting miles away in Damascus?
They trace the chain of command, just like a modern war crimes tribunal would. When Yazid took power, his initial mandate to his governor in Kufa, Ubayd ibn Ziyad, was explicit, but it was political.
What was the order exactly?
The directive was to secure the allegiance of Imam Hussain at all costs and to neutralize the political threat to his new government.
But see, this is the question people always ask. The argument you see online all the time. Was there a direct order to kill him? Did the classical scholars find a letter saying, go and kill Hussein?
No, they didn't.
Okay.
And this is where the forensic examination gets very precise. Looking at the earliest surviving records, there is no explicit written order from Yazid instructing his governor to commit murder.
So it was just about containment.
Right. The written mandate was focused on containment, isolation, forcing political submission. But Ziyad, along with field commanders like Shamir ibn Joshan, took that mandate and escalated it.
They turned it into kinetic military force?
Exactly. They instituted the blockade, they denied water, and eventually they executed the massacre.
See, this is where I really struggle with how some people defend Yazid today. Because they'll say, well, look, there's no paper trail for the murder, so his hands are clean.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
But think about how a large corporation works today. If a CEO tells a regional director, crush the competition by any means necessary.
Right.
And that director goes out and literally burns down a rival's factory, the CEO might say, whoa, I only meant aggressive marketing.
Oh, of course.
But if the CEO then turns around and gives that director $1 million bonus instead of firing them and calling the cops, I mean, the CEO owns that crime.
They absolutely endorse it. And classical Islamic jurists understood that exact logic. You don't even need the modern corporate analogy because that legal principle was already baked into their texts.
Really? Under what branch of law?
In classical Islamic international law, which is CR, and in criminal jurisprudence, Jinayat, there is a very robust doctrine of command responsibility.
Wow, okay.
So even though the tactical on-the-ground execution was carried out by Ibn Ziyad and his commanders, the ultimate liability rests firmly with Yazid.
Because of how he reacted afterward.
Precisely. Because after Karbala happened, Yazid did not punish Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. He didn't demote him. He didn't strip him of his governorship.
He kept him in power.
He actually rewarded him. He failed completely to establish any form of judicial accountability. And on top of that, the severed head of Imam Hussain was brought to Damascus and publicly displayed.
Subhanallah. That is just...
It's heavy. And legally speaking, in Islamic jurisprudence, silence and the failure to punish subordinates for a crime equals complicity. By rewarding the outcome, he became an accessory after the fact.
When you lay out the legal mechanism like that, it's undeniable. It wasn't just some administrative mistake. It was an endorsed atrocity.
Absolutely.
But this reality opens up this massive moral knot. I mean, if his guilt was so clear, you had all these surviving companions of the Prophet still living in Medina, right?
Yes, many of them.
Why on earth did they not rise up? Why didn't they gather an army and just overthrow him immediately?
It's a question that really challenges our modern sensibilities. And historians have analyzed this for centuries. We are talking about major, highly revered companions like Abdullah ibn Umar and Abu Sa'id al-Khudri.
Right.
But when push came to shove, they explicitly refused to break their oath of allegiance, their bay'ah to Yazid.
I have to admit, sitting here today, that is incredibly hard to grasp.
I know, it really is.
Because in our modern mindset, if you see a horrific injustice, staying quiet feels like you are approving of it. The idea of just maintaining an oath to a state that killed the Prophet's grandson, it feels like complicity disguised as patience, you know?
It does feel that way to us, but that's because we're completely removed from their trauma.
Yeah.
You have to understand what that older generation in Medina had just lived through.
The previous civil wars.
Exactly. Their refusal to rebel wasn't cowardice. And it absolutely wasn't an endorsement of Yazid's morals or what happened at Karbala. They were making a painful, calculated application of prophetic guidance to avoid fitna,
Isl strife.
severe civil war. They wanted to preserve the Jama'ah, the unified community of believers. These older companions had lived through the first civil war after Uthman was assassinated.
Right, the first fitna.
They had literally stood on battlefields and watched tens of thousands of Muslims slaughter each other. They saw society tear itself apart.
So they knew what rebellion actually looked like on the ground.
Exactly. To them, armed rebellion Kruj wasn't some romantic crusade for justice. It meant the total collapse of society. They firmly believed that pulling the sword against the state, even a tyrannical state, would cause far more bloodshed and destruction for innocent people than just enduring the tyrant.
Wow, so they were basically doing a kind of horrific math. They separated the constitutional legitimacy of the state from the personal sins of the guy sitting on the throne.
That is exactly what they did. A very cold, pragmatic distinction to prioritize the survival of the community. And the fascinating thing is, if we look strictly at the military and administrative data from those 3.5 years, it actually worked.
Wait, really? Because we instinctively assume that a corrupt, unjust ruler means a crumbling kingdom.
We want it to mean that.
Yeah. We want instant karma. We want the skies to darken and the borders to collapse the second a tyrant does something terrible.
It's a natural human desire for cosmic justice. But the historical texts reveal a very different reality. The machinery of the early Islamic State was incredibly robust. It operated largely independently of the caliph's moral failings.
So the empire wasn't shrinking?
Not at all. During Yazid's brief reign, the borders of the empire actually expanded significantly.
How does that even happen when the political center is in such turmoil? How does the state keep functioning?
Because they had developed deep, decentralized bureaucratic momentum. You had military commanders operating on frontiers thousands of miles away, and they didn't need daily instructions from Damascus to do their jobs.
Makes sense.
For example, the famous general Uqba ibn Nafi was pushing deep into North Africa, Ifriqiya. His armies were highly organized. They reached all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. He established the major garrison city of Kairouan during this exact period.
It's fascinating and honestly a bit unsettling. They're laying the foundations for new cities while the heart of the empire is bleeding.
Yeah, and it wasn't just North Africa. The Byzantine frontier al-Awasim remained heavily fortified and active. Yazid himself, before he became caliph, had actually spent time on that frontier. He participated in an early siege of Constantinople under his father, Muawiya.
Right.
Furthermore, the internal bureaucracies were just functioning. The agricultural land tax, the Kharaj was routed smoothly. Military payrolls were distributed on time.
The trains were running on time, basically.
Exactly. The provincial governors kept the roads safe for trade. The empire wasn't collapsing territorially or financially.
Okay, I need to pause and think about this. Because if the mail is running, the soldiers are getting paid, and new cities are being built, where do all these wild stories about Yazid come from?
Ah, yes.
Because if you step away from the serious historical texts and just listen to popular stories, you hear claims that he was a totally unhinged apostate. You hear he abandoned prayer entirely, spent his days hopelessly drunk, and entertained himself by dressing up pet monkeys in the court.
Monkey stories, yes.
Yeah. How do you square a highly functional administrative state with this image of a chaotic madman playing with monkeys?
This is probably the most critical part of our audit today. This is where we had to actively separate verified historical atrocities from medieval information warfare.
Okay.
Because there are verified catastrophic sins on his record. Karbala is verified and undisputed. Later in his reign, the brutal sack of Medina by his army, the incident of Al-Hara, is completely verified.
Yeah, that was horrific.
And the collateral damage to the Kaaba when his forces laid siege to Mecca, also verified.
I mean, those three events alone are heavy enough to permanently ruin a legacy.
They are more than enough. But for later political dynasties, it wasn't enough. And this is where the unverified myths enter the picture. The claims of habitual incest, the total abandonment of the 5 daily prayers, the pet monkeys.
Where did those come from?
When serious historians analyze those specific claims, they recognize them instantly as standardized, late antique invective character tropes.
I am not familiar with that term. What makes it a trope?
A trope is a recognizable formula. Long before Islam even existed, when a Byzantine emperor or a Sasanian king was overthrown, the new ruling dynasty would write histories accusing the fallen king of these exact same things.
Wait, really?
Yes, it was always incest, crippling drunkenness, and bizarre obsessions with animals. It was a standardized political tool used in the ancient world to completely dehumanize and delegitimize a fallen regime.
Wow. It's like the ancient equivalent of a coordinated smear campaign. If you're listening to this, think about our media landscape today, you know.
Exactly.
Think about how easily a narrative gets twisted when a new administration takes over and wants to make the old boss look as evil or incompetent as possible. It really makes you wonder how the early Islamic scholars managed to sift the actual facts from the propaganda.
It required immense scholarly rigor. Because generations after Yazid, when the Abbasid dynasty violently overthrew the Umayyads, the Abbasid court historians systematically weaponized these old tropes.
To justify their own revolution.
Precisely. They amplified them to retroactively delegitimize the entire Umayyad bloodline. They needed the Umayyads to look not just politically flawed, but fundamentally demonic. And at the same time, you had early Zubayrid political factions and early pro-Shia oral traditions expanding and adding layers to the details of Karbala to maximize emotional mobilization for their causes.
So the verified administrative reality of the state and the verified actual crimes both get buried under layers of political propaganda.
Yes, and this myth-making was so powerful that it didn't just alter the narrative of how Yazid lived, it completely overwrote the reality of how he died.
I wanted to ask about his death, because the stories surrounding his end are incredibly dramatic.
Oh, very dramatic. If you listen to folkloric narratives told in streets and gatherings over the centuries, they claim he suffered a supernatural, terrifying death.
Right.
You'll hear variations saying he was struck directly by divine lightning, or burned alive in a freak accident, or that he drowned in a vat of his own wine as a form of cosmic retribution.
Again, we see that human desire for the universe to instantly balance the scales. People invented these fiery, dramatic deaths because the idea that a man responsible for Karbala might just die quietly in his bed. It didn't feel like justice. It didn't feel like enough.
Exactly. But the historical reality is entirely mundane. He died a completely natural, undramatic death from an acute illness, something resembling pleurisy or a severe fever.
So no lightning.
No lightning, no fire. It happened at his rural residence in Huwaran in the year 64 AH. He was relatively young, only about 36 to 38 years old.
Just a sudden, ordinary sickness.
A sudden sickness that brought the entire machinery of the state to a screeching halt. Because the real consequence of his death wasn't supernatural. It was a devastating political reality for everyday people.
What happened?
Well, he was succeeded by his son, Muawiya II. But his son was very young and extremely sickly. Just weeks after taking the oath of allegiance, Muawiya II abdicated the throne.
He just walked away from the most powerful position in the world.
He walked away and he died shortly after. And that sudden, complete vacuum of power caused the immediate collapse of the Sufyanid line of the Umayyad dynasty.
Wow.
And that collapse triggered the exact nightmare that the older companions in Medina had sacrificed everything to prevent. It triggered the Second Civil War, the Second Fitna. The Islamic world fractured into competing factions, and it took years of brutal, exhausting warfare to piece the state back together.
It really shows how incredibly fragile the whole system was, right? Beneath the expanding borders and the smooth tax collection, you pull one thread, a sudden fever in a rural residence, and the entire social order comes undone.
It is a very sobering reminder of how history actually unfolds, compared to the neat moral stories we try to impose on it centuries later. And, when you look at this entire forensic audit, it forces us to reflect on our own minds and how we process the world.
Yeah.
Because if 1,400 years of emotional storytelling, factional grief, and court propaganda can blur the lines between a ruler's highly functional administrative reality and his verified, horrific moral crimes, we have to ask ourselves a question today.
Which is?
How are we filtering the information, the news, and the propaganda we consume right now? Are we letting our own desire for a perfect, cartoonish villain blind us to the complex and often deeply uncomfortable realities of human history and human nature?
To rebuild your mental peace and legacy today, give charity, sponsor a student, and plant a tree. May Allah grant us success. Don't forget to leave Taban. Oh, come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.